Andrew Carlisle's penthouse greeted Helen with the sterile silence of a mausoleum. Moonlight penetrated through the panoramic windows, flooding the living room with cold, silvery radiance and transforming the minimalist furniture into geometric ghosts. The 60th floor, the pinnacle of Sentinel Tower, her father's first landmark project. Helen stood in the middle of this space, feeling like an archaeologist who had stumbled into someone else's tomb. Her fingers glided over the facets of a crystal statuette, yet another architectural award whose name she hadn't even bothered to read. The cold, perfectly polished object rested in her palms with the weight of someone else's achievements. She methodically wrapped it in bubble wrap, carefully sealed it with tape, and placed it in a cardboard box alongside dozens of similar trophies. This wasn't an act of mourning. This was inventory. Helen Carlisle was cataloging her father's life with the same professional detachment she applied to the archives of deceased merchants and forgotten officials that crossed her desk. She straightened, tucking a stray lock of dark blonde hair behind her ear, and her gaze drifted toward the panoramic window. New York sprawled below, shimmering with millions of lights. A city of legacy. A city Andrew Carlisle had reshaped according to his vision, erasing dozens of old neighborhoods and erecting glass towers in their place. To the world, he had been a demiurge, a visionary. To Helen, he'd been an absent father whose greatness had been too loud to leave room for a quiet daughter. The penthouse oppressed her with its flawless design. Polished concrete floors, black leather sofas with strict geometry, walls the color of wet asphalt with a single accent, an enormous black and white photograph of a skyscraper under construction. There was nothing personal here, nothing accidental. Every object proclaimed status and taste, but remained silent about the man himself. Helen ran her palm across the cool surface of a marble console table. Her hand left a barely visible trace of moisture on the mirror-like surface, which immediately began to evaporate. She felt her own insignificance in this space. A small archivist in a stretched cardigan and simple dark trousers, a woman whose monthly salary couldn't cover the cost of this single glass coffee table. She felt no grief, only a heavy, crushing emptiness. Andrew Carlisle had died 3 days ago. A heart attack in his office, surrounded by blueprints for yet another project that was supposed to transform the city's skyline. The media buzzed. The architecture world mourned a genius. And Helen packed crystal and thought about how she'd never truly known this man. Crossing the threshold into her father's study, she froze for a moment. This room was the heart of the penthouse, its true temple. A massive desk of black oak, polished to a mirror finish, occupied the center of the space. Behind it stretched a wall of dark glass through which nighttime New York was visible, a constellation of lights spreading to the horizon. To the right and left stood shelves of the same black wood, filled with architectural volumes, project folders, building models in glass cases. Everything was perfectly organized, catalogued, and lifeless. Helen approached the desk. Her reflection slid across its glossy surface, a pale face with gray eyes framed by loose strands of hair, glasses in thin frames. She placed her palm on the desktop, feeling its coolness. This was where he died. This was where his heart, exhausted by years of obsession and sleepless nights, had finally refused to serve. The desk drawers were concealed within its monolithic construction. Helen crouched and began methodically opening them. Upper left, pens, pencils, rulers, technical drawing instruments. Everything arranged with absolute precision, like exhibits in a museum of drafting tools. Lower left, folders of documents, contracts, budgets. She didn't sort through them, simply noting mentally that they'd need to be transferred to the attorney. The upper right drawer. Helen reached to pull it open and froze. Her eye, trained to spot inconsistencies in old archival inventories, to identify forgeries in historical documents, caught an anomaly. The drawer was open a millimeter. maybe 2. So imperceptible that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But in this kingdom of absolute symmetry and order, in a penthouse where every line had been calculated to the degree, this detail screamed violation. She cautiously pushed the drawer with her fingers. It yielded with a barely audible scrape. Inside lay ordinary contents: a stack of business cards, a notebook, USB drives in a neat row. Helen ran her palm along the interior surface. The wood was smooth, perfectly sanded. Too smooth. She repeated the motion, this time slower, almost meditative. Her fingertips detected a barely noticeable change in texture. A seam. Thin as a hair, but perceptible to someone accustomed to working with fragile paper and microscopic details of antique bindings. She pressed. Click. A false panel, recessed into the back wall of the drawer, moved out a centimeter. Helen's heart accelerated. She removed the panel completely. Behind it opened a niche lined with deep burgundy velvet, an island of old-fashioned luxury in this temple of minimalism. In the niche lay a single object, a journal. Helen extracted it and placed it on the desk. The cover was calfskin, once probably cognac-colored, now worn and darkened by time and touch. The corners were abraded almost to the base. Scratches marked the cover, along with a stain from spilled liquid that had left a blurred spot. This was an object that had been used, an object that had lived. Helen took the journal in her hands. Unlike the cold, lifeless world of the penthouse, the leather was warm to the touch, as if it retained residual heat from other palms. She ran her thumb across the embossing on the spine, the initials AJC stamped in gold, half worn away. The weight of the journal was pleasant, balanced. This was the first object in this house that spoke not of the genius who had built a city, but of the man who had once been her father. She opened the cover. Inside, on the end paper, the same gold engraving bore a date: January 2025. Less than a month ago. Her finger settled on the first page. The paper was thick, cream-colored, pleasant. Her father's handwriting, sharp, angular, nervous, filled the lines. Helen recognized it instantly. The same letters from the rare postcards he'd sent her in childhood from business trips. "I'm beginning this journal not from sentimentality," the first entry began, "but from desperation. I need to document what I've understood, what I've become part of, and what I must correct before it's too late." The pad of her index finger touched the first line, traced the contour of the first letter. Click. The sound was short, dry, metallic. It came from somewhere outside, from the foyer. Helen froze, her finger suspended on the journal page. The silence of the penthouse, which had seemed absolute, suddenly filled with presence. She held her breath, listening. Another click. Then a scraping sound, low and professional. This wasn't the sound of a key being inserted into a lock. This was the sound of a lock being picked. A sound Helen had heard once in a crime documentary about master thieves. Her world narrowed to that sound. Blood drained from her face, leaving icy cold. She was on the 60th floor, in a penthouse with a security system her father had called impregnable. Concierge downstairs, surveillance cameras, coded elevator, and someone was breaking through the front door. Panic was sharp, physical, flooding her body with adrenaline. But beneath it, deeper, another instinct activated. The instinct of an archivist, guardian of unique, irreplaceable artifacts. Helen looked at the journal lying before her on the desk. The only copy. Her father's final words, which he'd hidden in a secret compartment. Words beginning with mentions of desperation and the need to correct something. Her hands moved faster than thought. She grabbed the journal, pressed it to her chest, then shoved it under her cardigan, tucking it into her waistband. The cold leather of the cover touched her skin, raising goosebumps. The journal pressed against her ribs became part of her body, a secret that needed to be preserved. The lock's click grew louder, more final. The front door was opening. Helen looked around. The elevator was in the foyer, where the sounds were coming from. A trap. The windows didn't open, monolithic glass panels. She was in a cage 600 feet above the ground. A memory flashed through her consciousness. She'd been 14. Her father, on one of the rare days when he was home and in good spirits, had shown her the penthouse blueprints spread across this same desk. He'd traced his finger along the blue lines, explaining the smart home system, the routing of utilities. "You see, Helen," he'd said, "real architecture isn't just the facade. It's the invisible infrastructure, the building's heart." The utility room, far end of the hallway. Helen launched herself forward. Her soft, flat shoes were silent on the polished marble floor. She crossed the study, slipped into the hallway, and ran in the opposite direction from the foyer. Her heart pounded against her ribs, pressing the hidden journal against them. The utility room door was inconspicuous, painted the same color as the wall, with no handle, just a barely visible outline and a button. Helen pressed it. The door slid silently aside, revealing a narrow passage. She stepped inside, turned, and pressed the button from the other side. The door closed, cutting her off from the marble luxury of the penthouse. The utility room was the antithesis of the living room. A cramped closet, no more than 30 square feet, filled with humming equipment. Server racks with blinking green lights, circuit breaker panels, thick bundles of cables snaking along the walls like metallic veins. The air was warm, almost hot, saturated with the smell of heated plastic and ozone. The low, vibrating hum of ventilation and cooling systems filled the space, creating the sensation that she'd climbed inside a massive, living organism. Helen leaned back against the equipment rack, feeling its heat penetrate through her cardigan. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing. The hum of the machines absorbed all sounds, but through it, as if through a thickness of water, she detected something else. Footsteps. In the penthouse. She opened her eyes. In the utility door, almost imperceptible, was a viewing slot, a narrow strip of reinforced glass at eye level. Helen cautiously approached it and peered into the hallway. Two beams from tactical flashlights danced in the darkness of the living room. Bright, cold cones of light plucked fragments of the interior from the gloom. The corner of a sofa, the edge of a painting, the gleam of a crystal statuette. Behind the flashlights, the silhouettes of two men were visible. They moved soundlessly, professionally, like shadows. No words, no rustling of clothing, only gliding beams of light. One of the men turned his head, and for a moment, light slid across his face. Helen distinguished work coveralls, a dark balaclava tightly covering his head. They weren't dressed like burglars. They were dressed like specialists performing a job. The flashlights pivoted and headed toward the study. Both men entered, and the light beams disappeared from Helen's field of vision. But sounds carried clearly, amplified by the acoustics of empty rooms. The creak of a drawer being opened, the rustle of papers being sorted. A dull thud, something heavy, possibly a building model, set on the floor. Another drawer, the whisper of turning pages. They worked methodically, quickly, like surgeons dissecting a body in search of a specific organ. Helen stood pressed against the wall of the utility room, listening as foreign hands rifled through the last traces of her father's life. Her own breathing seemed deafening to her. The journal under her cardigan pressed against her ribs, reminding her of its existence with every breath. She pressed her palm against it, as if fearing it might give itself away. The sounds from the study didn't stop. One drawer after another. The shelves. She heard books being moved, pages of architectural volumes rustling. The search was total and absolutely focused. They didn't get distracted, didn't pause to examine expensive items. They were interested only in the study's contents. Then the sounds subsided. A silence descended, even more ominous than the noise of the search. Helen heard the two men conversing quietly. Their voices were muffled, distorted by the balaclavas, but the tone was clear. Disappointment, irritation. Footsteps. One of the men exited the study into the hallway. Through the slot, Helen saw the beam of his flashlight slide along the walls, illuminating closed doors to bedrooms, the bathroom. He moved slowly down the hallway, checking each door. Approaching the utility room, Helen's world narrowed to the width of the viewing slot. She watched the man walk directly toward her. His steps were soft, cautious, but inexorable. He moved slowly, as if sensing something, intuition telling him the search wasn't finished. The shadow from his boots fell on the floor at the very door of the utility room. He stopped. Helen stopped breathing. Her back pressed into the metal server rack, cold penetrating through her clothing. The palm pressed against the journal under her cardigan grew damp with sweat. The equipment hum, which a second ago had seemed deafening, now became distant, irrelevant background noise. The entire world compressed to this door and the shadow beyond it. Through the slot, she saw the dark silhouette in the balaclava. He stood motionless, staring at the door, studying it. His hand slowly reached toward the open button. The metallic, distorted crackle of a radio shattered the silence. The sound came from the study, sharp and commanding. The voice was indistinct, distorted by interference and the speaker, but the tone left no room for ambiguity. This was an order. The man at the door froze. His hand hung in the air, inches from the button. Helen heard him exhale, a short, disappointed sound. Another second of indecision, then his shadow retreated. Footsteps receded back toward the foyer. Helen heard fragments of a brief exchange between the two men, a quiet trade of words. Then the click of the closing front door. Silence. Helen continued standing motionless, not trusting her own ears. Her heart pounded in her temples. Breath escaped in short, convulsive bursts. She counted 1 minute, 2, 5, 10. The hum of servers was the only sound. Her legs filled with lead, muscles cramped from tension. Finally, she forced herself to move. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the door release button. The panel slid silently aside. Helen peered into the hallway. Empty. Darkness and silence. She emerged from her hiding place, each step seeming too loud. She passed the living room, where her boxes of packed belongings stood untouched. She returned to the study. The ransacking was obvious, but orderly. Desk drawers pulled out, their contents neatly arranged on the surface. Folders on the shelves shifted, some lying in stacks on the floor. Building models had been extracted from their cases and stood nearby, like suspects in a lineup. Someone had methodically examined every item in this room. But Helen's gaze caught on something else. On the desk, among scattered blueprints and documents, lay her father's expensive Swiss watch, a Jaeger-LeCoultre Reverso. Beside it, his laptop, a MacBook Pro, latest model. On the floor by the chair lay an open wooden box. Inside was visible a stack of $100 bills bound with a bank wrapper. Next to it, a gold signet ring with onyx that her father had worn to formal events. All of it in plain sight. All of it worth a fortune, and none of it touched. Helen slowly turned, surveying the study. The picture assembled in her mind piece by piece, like a puzzle, and with each new detail, the icy horror of understanding gripped her tighter. They hadn't taken a watch worth $100,000. They hadn't taken a laptop with potentially valuable information. They hadn't taken money and jewelry. They'd broken into the most secure penthouse in the city, risked surveillance cameras and the concierge, spent time on a methodical search, and left with nothing, because what they'd come for was now under her cardigan, pressed against her ribs, burning her skin with its heat. The journal. The small, worn journal in its leather cover ceased being simply her father's final entries. It became something else. Something so important that professionals were willing to breach an impregnable fortress to retrieve it. Something that men in balaclavas hunted for in the night. Evidence. Helen sank onto the edge of her father's chair, her legs buckling. Her palm settled on the journal's cover through the fabric of her cardigan. Pages she hadn't had time to read. Words about desperation and the need to correct something. Words someone desperately wanted to bury with their author. She raised her eyes to the panoramic window. Beyond it stretched nighttime New York, vast, indifferent, beautiful. Her father's city. The city of his triumph and, possibly, his crime. And now this city was watching her. Because she, a quiet archivist who had spent her life hiding behind yellowed maps and fragile documents, had accidentally become the keeper of a secret. A secret someone was willing to kill to bury. Helen Carlyle was no longer just a daughter who'd come to pack up her dead father's belongings. She had become a target. The apartment door closed behind Helen with a dull, reassuring sound. She turned the key in the lock, slid the heavy metal bolt that her grandmother had installed years ago, and pressed her forehead against the cold wood. Breath escaped in short, uneven bursts. Her hands trembled. The journal under her cardigan pressed against her ribs, reminding her of its presence. She was home. The small studio apartment in the pre-war building greeted her with silence broken only by the measured ticking of an old wall clock. High ceilings with molding darkened by time. Bookshelves along the walls filled to capacity with volumes on history, cartography, bookbinding. A small writing desk by the window overlooking a quiet courtyard. There was no cold gleam of marble and glass from her father's penthouse here. This was her world, orderly, predictable, safe, or had seemed so just a few hours ago. Helen removed her cardigan, extracted the journal, and placed it on the table. The worn leather cover looked incongruously plain among her academic books and archival catalogs. She walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, mechanically retrieved a cup, a chamomile tea bag. The familiar ritual helped calm her nerves, restore control over herself. The water in the kettle began to boil. Helen poured the tea, took the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth penetrate through the porcelain. She returned to the room, sat in her worn armchair beneath a floor lamp with a green shade, that very spot where she spent evenings with books, where she felt absolutely safe. The journal lay on the table, dark and heavy, like a stone fallen from the sky that had punctured the roof of her quiet life. She took a sip of tea. The hot liquid burned her tongue, but the pain was real, anchoring her in the present. Ignorance after the horror she'd experienced seemed unbearable. She needed to understand. Understand why professionals had broken into the penthouse. Understand what was on these pages so dangerous that men in balaclavas hunted for them. Helen Carlyle reached out and opened the journal to the second page. Her father's handwriting, which she remembered as confident and commanding, was different here. The letters didn't march in neat rows but stumbled, overlapping each other. The pressure varied from line to line. There were corrections, cross-outs, words written over other words. This was the handwriting of a man writing in desperation, not triumph. Childhood is the foundation on which you build your entire life, Helen read. My foundation was rotten boards, a leaking roof, and the smell of poverty. A shack outside Pittsburgh. Winters when the water in the bucket froze and my mother burned newspapers in the stove for heat. My father disappeared for weeks, returned drunk, reeking, pathetic. I hated him. But most of all, I hated the grayness, that wretchedness that surrounded us like a swamp, swallowing the living. Helen slowly turned the page. She read about a boy who made himself a vow to escape, a vow to build a new world, shining and beautiful, a world where there wouldn't be a drop of that filth and hopelessness. Architecture became his prayer and his revenge simultaneously. I didn't just want to build structures, Andrew Carlyle wrote. I wanted to erase the past from the face of the earth. Every demolished shack, every old tenement I replaced with a glass tower, that was a victory. Victory over my childhood. I was building monuments to my escape. She didn't see a genius. She saw a fugitive. Not a demiurge creating a city according to his vision, but a frightened child who spent his entire life running from ghosts. Every line erased the monumental myth that surrounded Andrew Carlyle's name, leaving in its place a portrait of a deeply unhappy, lonely man. This was an agonizing introduction. Helen wasn't grieving the father she'd lost. She was mourning the one she'd never had a chance to know. The clock showed 2:30 in the morning when she stumbled upon an entry dated 3 weeks before Andrew Carlyle's death. Today I saw a face. Helen straightened in her chair. The tea had long gone cold, forgotten. The lamp cast a circle of yellow light on the pages, leaving the rest of the room in darkness. Protest at the Apex construction site. Another demonstration against evictions. The usual noise I'd grown accustomed to. But one of them, a young guy in a work jacket, held a sign, "This was my home." I looked at him. Stefan Kowalski, I learned his name later. 23 years old. His family was evicted from the building that stood where my excavation is now. The compensation was pittance, as always, and I saw rage in his eyes. That same rage I had at 19 when I looked at our shack, cursing heaven and earth. The rage of someone having their last possession taken. The rage of powerlessness. I stand here in my Italian overcoat next to a billion-dollar excavation. I'm the embodiment of success. I escaped. But to do that, I destroyed the worlds of kids just like I was. I'm building my new, shining city, erasing other people's homes, other people's roots, other people's memories from the earth. I've become what I hated my entire life. I've become the force that destroys. Only now it's not called poverty, it's called progress. Helen closed her eyes. The story ceased being black and white. The world stopped dividing into demiurge and his victims. Her father was both. And this duality was tearing him apart. She rose from the chair, feeling how stiff her shoulders and back had become. Several hours of motionless sitting had taken their toll. Helen stretched her neck, approached the window. She needed a distraction, even for a minute, to give her eyes rest from the feverish handwriting. Outside the window was the deep hour of night. The courtyard drowned in darkness, interrupted only by dim streetlights. A few parked cars, dumpsters, a playground, a ghost in the night. And a black sedan on the opposite side of the street. Helen froze. The car stood beneath a tree, partially hidden by shadow. The license plate was dirty, unreadable even from this distance. An ordinary sight for a residential neighborhood. People park wherever. She moved away from the window, returned to the chair, but her concentration was broken. An hour later, when the journal began a new, particularly complex fragment about finances, Helen stood again to stretch, mechanically approached the window. The black sedan stood in the same place, and beside it now stood a man. Dark jacket, jeans, short haircut. He was smoking, leaning on the hood, looking somewhere to the side, as if absent-mindedly. But his posture was too tense for a casual smoker. Shoulders squared, weight on the balls of his feet, not his heels. Readiness for movement. The posture of a predator in ambush. Cold spread through Helen's body, starting from her solar plexus and flowing in icy tentacles toward her extremities. This wasn't paranoia. After what had happened at the penthouse, after the men in balaclavas, this was logic. Her quiet, inconspicuous street, her fortress, was no longer safe. The man took out his phone, raised it to his ear, said a few words. His lips moved, but through the glass no sound was audible. He hung up and raised his head, looking directly at the windows of her floor. Directly at her. Helen jumped back from the window, pressing her back against the wall. Her heart pounded in her throat. Had he seen her? Or was it coincidence? Not coincidence. In her life, there were no more coincidences. Her brain switched to cold archival efficiency mode. Panic retreated, yielding to a clear plan. She had an advantage. They didn't know she'd spotted them. She had a few minutes. Helen sprang into action, grabbed the backpack she usually carried to the archive, threw the journal into it, wrapping it in a wool scarf for protection. Laptop, charger, passport, cash from her stash hidden in a book, phone and its charger, change of underwear. All movements were quick, precise, without excess fuss. Without turning on the light in the hallway, she approached the door leading to the back exit. This feature of old pre-war buildings had always seemed an archaic quirk. Now it became salvation. The door opened onto a narrow staircase descending to an interior courtyard well that connected several buildings in the block. Helen threw on a dark coat, took the backpack. One last time she looked back at her apartment, an island of order and safety, unknown when she could return. If she could return at all. She opened the back exit door and silently stepped onto the staircase, descended, holding the railing. Blood pounded in her ears, drowning out her cautious steps. The crash of the front entrance door shattered the night silence. They were here. Helen dove through a low, dark archway leading to the adjacent courtyard. Behind her came heavy footsteps, the clang of metal, muffled voices. 2 men. She would recognize that professional quietness of movement anywhere. The same men from the penthouse. They were running after her. Faster, stronger, more ruthless. She heard their boots striking the courtyard asphalt, how they vaulted over the low fence she'd circled around. But they were running through foreign territory, and Helen was running through her map. In her consciousness surfaced not fear, but a clear image. A map of this neighborhood from 1954, which she'd restored last year. Yellowed paper, faded ink, but incredible accuracy of detail. The architect compiler had noted not only streets, but every through courtyard, every archway, every service exit. Helen had spent 3 months over this map, restoring damaged fragments, and every line had imprinted in her memory. She didn't see walls and fences. She saw a route. Helen ran into a large old courtyard with several identical archways leading in different directions. Her pursuers were almost upon her. She heard their breathing, heavy and steady. Instead of continuing straight, she sharply turned left, dove into the nearest entrance. Staircase. Down, not up. Concrete steps beneath her feet. The smell of dampness and old paint. A semi-basement whose existence she knew from building records studied in the archive. A narrow corridor with peeling plaster, old doors to utility rooms on both sides, and at the end, a service exit marked on that very map. Helen pushed the door. It yielded with a screech. Cold night air struck her face. She tumbled into a completely different courtyard, a block from where they'd been overtaking her. Behind came confused shouts, rough voices distorted by fury. They'd lost sight of her. Helen pressed against the wall, catching her breath. Her lungs burned. Hands trembled from adrenaline, but in her chest, beneath the fear and exhaustion, pulsed a new, unfamiliar feeling. Pride. Her useless knowledge, her obsession with the past, her memory of forgotten maps, all of it had just saved her life. The quiet archives proved stronger than brute force. An hour later, Helen Carlyle sat in the reading room of the neighborhood library. The place was open 24 hours for students preparing for exams. Several young people dozed over textbooks. The security guard at the entrance didn't even look up when she entered. Here it was almost as safe as in her archive. High ceilings, rows of bookshelves, subdued light from green lamps. The smell of old paper and silence, broken only by the rustle of pages. Her world. She settled in a far corner, pulled out her laptop, connected to the public Wi-Fi. She couldn't return home, at least not yet. She needed an ally, someone from her father's world who could explain what was happening, someone she could trust. Helen opened the browser and began searching. Everywhere, articles about Andrew Carlyle's death. Genius gone too soon. Architect who changed the face of New York. Tragic loss for the art world. And in every article, commentary from George Samuel Barrett. Andrew wasn't just my partner, he was my brother, one newspaper quoted. In the photo, Barrett stood by the casket, face grieving, eyes moist. We walked the entire path together, from the first project to the last. His genius was the light that illuminated our way, Helen remembered. George Barrett. She'd seen him a few times in childhood when he came to her father to discuss finances. A heavy-set, good-natured man who always brought her chocolate and called her smart girl. The only person from her father's business circle who treated her humanely. She rummaged in the backpack and extracted Andrew Carlyle's old address book, which she'd grabbed from the penthouse almost mechanically, flipped through the yellowed pages. There. George, cell, and a phone number. Helen looked at the screen. 4:30 in the morning. Too early? But this was an emergency. She found a secluded corner between shelves where she couldn't be heard and dialed the number. Rings. Once. Twice. 3 times. Hello? The voice was sleepy, but cleared almost immediately. Who is this? Mr. Barrett? This is Helen. Helen Carlyle. A pause. Then the voice on the other end became warm, enveloping, almost paternal. Helen, sweetheart. My God, where are you? I've been so worried. After the funeral, you disappeared. No one could find you. The words poured forth, sincere, solicitous. Helen felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. She wasn't alone. Mr. Barrett, I need help. Her voice trembled. I found my father's journal, and now they're hunting me. People broke into the penthouse, chased me to my home. I don't know what to do. A journal? In Barrett's voice sounded a note of what? Alarm? Interest? What journal, sweetheart? It was hidden in a secret compartment. My father wrote about... Helen hesitated. About his projects. About plans. Someone really wants to get it. My God. Barrett gasped with genuine alarm. Helen, listen to me carefully. Are you safe now? Where are you? At the library. Neighborhood library. Good. Very good. Listen, sweetheart. Don't call anyone else. You hear? No one. Not even the police. I have connections. I'll smooth everything over. Just sit tight. Keep your head down. I'll call you myself in a couple hours, as soon as I find out anything. Agreed?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
You're my smart girl. Everything will be fine. I promise. He hung up. Helen clutched the phone in her hand, feeling enormous, fragile relief. She had an ally. An adult, influential, experienced. Barrett would smooth things over, he promised. She returned to the table, opened the journal. Waiting for the call and feeling relatively safe, she decided to read to the end. A third of the book remained. The final pages were written in different handwriting. The pressure had weakened. The letters became more rounded, almost soft. There were fewer corrections. This was the handwriting of a man who had made a decision. I found the way out. Helen leaned closer to the lamp. Stefan Kowalski and his family. Dozens of other families evicted for Apex. I can't give them back their homes. But I can give them new ones. I've revised the project. The first 10 floors of the tower can be completely redesigned as social housing, apartments for the evicted. Not compensation. Restitution. With my name on the project, Monolith can't refuse. This will cost $1 billion, maybe more. The board of directors will be furious. Investors might walk. But this is the only way to atone for at least part of what I've done. The building doesn't have to be just a monument to my ego. It can become an act of justice. The world around Helen froze. She reread the paragraph again and again. $1 billion. Social housing instead of luxury apartments. This wasn't just an act of repentance. This was a financial blow to Monolith Corporation. To people who'd invested money in the project, expecting enormous profit. Now the motive of her pursuers was crystal clear. They weren't protecting a dead man's reputation. They were protecting colossal money. The journal wasn't a sentimental note, but a document that could collapse their financial empire. If Andrew Carlisle's plan became public knowledge, investors, the public, authorities, all would demand its execution. The genius's final wish. And Monolith would lose billions. Helen raised her eyes, stunned by the scale. And at that moment her gaze fell on a large television mounted in the library's news hall. It was running without sound, showing a morning business program. In the studio, in a comfortable chair, a smiling George Barrett was giving an interview. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "George Barrett, Monolith guarantees stability to investors after tragedy." Barrett was saying something, gesturing with rounded, enveloping movements. His face radiated confidence and care. Behind his shoulder, slightly to the side, stood another man. Tall, with short hair, in an impeccable dark suit. Victor Morrison, head of security for Monolith Corporation, a man who never appeared in public, who worked in the shadows. And there he stood next to Barrett, in one frame, as part of a unified team. Helen Carlisle's world collapsed in an instant. She stared at George Barrett's confident, satisfied face on the screen. At his eyes, which held not a drop of grief. At his smile, broad and self-satisfied. Then she shifted her gaze to her phone, where his number still glowed in recent calls. "Helen, sweetheart, where are you? I have connections. I'll smooth everything over. Don't call anyone else." Solicitude, care, paternal warmth. All of it was a lie. Professional, rehearsed deception. Her call hadn't been a plea for help. It had been a report to the enemy. Barrett wasn't saving her. He was finding out what she knew, where she was, how dangerous she was. He was buying time for Morrison. Time to organize a new hunt. The trap had snapped shut, and she herself had just told the hunters where the prey was hiding. George Barrett's smiling face filled the television screen in the library lobby. Next to him, slightly behind, stood another man, tall, with short hair and a square jaw. Helen Carlyle stared at this picture, and in her consciousness, a puzzle of betrayal assembled with methodical cruelty. Victor Morrison, head of security for Monolith Corporation. The Shadow Man. He never appeared in public. His name wasn't mentioned in the press. Helen had seen him only once at her father's funeral, where he'd stood in a far corner with an impenetrable face. And now he was here, on camera, next to Barrett. Not accidentally, demonstratively. The caption beneath the broadcast read, "George Barrett guarantees stability to investors after tragedy." Barrett was speaking, his full face radiating confidence, his hands drawing broad, reassuring gestures in the air. Morrison stood motionless, like a statue, his pale eyes looking somewhere above the camera. Two men, two poles of power, financial and forceful, together. Helen slowly set her cup of cold tea on the table. Her hands trembled. In her ears echoed Barrett's voice from the recent phone conversation. "Helen, sweetheart, where are you? Don't call anyone else. I'll smooth everything over." The lie was so total, so systemic, it took her breath away. She hadn't called an ally. She'd called the hunt coordinator, who now knew exactly where she was, that she had the journal, how frightened she was. Barrett played the role of kindly uncle with such polished conviction that she, an archivist trained to spot forgeries and fakes, had fallen for his bait. Police, her father's partners, security service, financial directors, lawyers. All of them were links in one chain, a closed circle that was slowly but inexorably tightening around her. The system was protecting itself, and it was absolute. Playing by their rules meant losing. Official channels were the path to the scaffold. Helen closed her eyes, pressing her palms to her temples. Her brain, accustomed to systematizing the chaos of archival documents, began working. If the system was closed and impregnable from within, she needed to attack from outside. If she had no power, money, or connections, she needed to use the only weapon she had: information. Not to lawyers, not to police, not to officials whom Morrison controlled through Barrett, but to where this system couldn't reach, where different rules operated. A name surfaced in her memory: the Open Platform, an independent online publication famous for its corruption investigations and complete absence of ties to power structures. Their journalists published what official media silenced. They were read by millions. They were feared. If she leaked Andrew Carlyle's journal there, it wouldn't just be telling the truth. It would be an information bomb thrown into the very center of their web. Morrison and his people were accustomed to operating in darkness. The spotlight would become her protection. The plan was risky, almost insane, but it was the only plan she had. Helen gathered her things, left the library, and moved through the evening streets. She needed anonymous internet access, not library Wi-Fi, which required registration. She needed a place where no one would remember her face or connect her to what she was about to do. She found an internet cafe within 20 minutes. A semi-basement space on the border between old and new neighborhoods, perfect neutral territory. A neon sign blinked above the entrance. Inside was dim and stuffy. A dozen computers stood in cubicles, separated by plywood partitions. Behind the counter sat a young guy in headphones, immersed in a game on his screen. He didn't even look up when Helen paid for an hour and walked to the farthest computer. She sat, extracted the journal from her backpack, and placed it next to the keyboard. The worn leather cover looked incongruously ancient against the dirty plastic and wires. Helen turned on the computer and began working. Her fingers moved quickly and precisely. She downloaded several anonymizing programs, created an encrypted email account through a VPN server located in another country. Every action was calibrated. She was no longer a victim. She was a saboteur, preparing for the main operation of her life. The phone lay nearby. She used its camera as a scanner. Page after page. Her father's sharp handwriting transformed into cold, impersonal files. Helen photographed every confession, every admission, every mention of Stefan Kowalski and the social housing plan. 40 minutes of continuous work. Her back stiffened, her eyes watered from the strain, but she didn't stop. Finally, the last page. She uploaded all the images to the computer, packed them into an encrypted archive, and opened the Open Platform website. The form for submitting investigative materials was simple, almost ascetic. Anonymity was guaranteed. Helen began typing a cover letter. This is the deathbed journal of architect Andrew Carlyle. What you know about his death and his final project is a lie. The truth is in these pages. He planned to convert the Apex Tower into social housing for evicted families. His death was too timely to be accidental. You're the only ones who can tell this story. Brief, precise, without emotion. The language of facts, which she understood best. Helen attached the archive to the letter. File size, 47 megabytes. The upload bar slowly crawled right. 10%, 25%, 50%. Each second felt like eternity. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her hands grew damp. 75%, 90%. File uploaded. The cursor hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. Once she pressed it, the information would leave her control and become public. Morrison would know. Barrett would know. The whole world would know. But that was exactly the point. Helen pressed the button. Message sent. She leaned back in the chair, exhaled air she seemed to have held in her lungs for an eternity. Done. She'd released the truth into the wild. Now it was no longer her personal burden, but a public problem. Helen methodically erased the browser history, cleared the cache, deleted all temporary files from the computer, packed the journal back into her backpack. Stood. Her legs were cotton, but she forced herself to walk steadily, calmly, past the guy at the counter who never looked up from his game. Cold evening air struck her face when she emerged onto the street. The sky over New York was overcast with clouds painted dirty orange from the city lights. Helen took a deep breath. Her lungs filled with freshness, and for the first time in the last 24 hours, the unbearable weight lifted from her shoulders. She believed, had to believe, that now she was safe. The journal had ceased being a secret. In a few hours, journalists would begin verification. In a day or two, the publication would explode the news space. Morrison and Barrett couldn't act openly when millions of eyes were watching. Light had become her armor. Helen Carlyle walked along the evening street toward the nearest subway station, and in her chest, beneath exhaustion and fear, pulsed a fragile, almost euphoric feeling of freedom. She'd done the impossible. A quiet archivist had beaten the system. The phone in her coat pocket vibrated. Helen stopped, pulled it out. The screen displayed, "Number unknown." Maybe a journalist? They worked fast, could have received the letter already. Or someone from the editorial staff wanting to clarify details. She accepted the call and raised the phone to her ear. "Hello?" Silence. Not empty, but filled. The silence of presence. Foolish move, Helen Carlyle. The voice was low, even, absolutely calm. A deep baritone without the slightest emotional modulation. A voice that spoke not with anger or threat, but with cold, clinical statement of fact. Morrison. The world around Helen compressed to the size of the phone receiver. Blood drained from her face, leaving her skin icy. "You think this will change anything?" The voice continued with the same imperturbable politeness. Naive. He knew. He knew she'd done it. He knew, right now, 20 minutes after she'd sent the letter. "How?" "Until we meet. Helen Carlyle." The connection cut off. The phone fell from Helen's numb fingers and struck the asphalt with a clatter. Euphoria evaporated instantly, replaced by animal, primal terror. Survival instinct exploded in her body before thought. She launched herself forward, plunging into the nearest dark alley, those same labyrinths of the old city that had saved her last time. Her boots struck the cobblestones, the backpack beat against her spine. Breath escaped in sharp bursts. An archway. Darkness. Salvation. Helen dove into a narrow passage between buildings and froze. From the shadows, 2 men emerged to meet her. Not workers in coveralls like at the penthouse. These were professionals. Dark jackets, jeans, short haircuts. Operatives. Their faces were impenetrable, their movements precise and confident. They weren't hurrying. They knew she was already trapped. Helen spun sharply around. A third man stood behind, cutting off the path of retreat. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the same cold, professional eyes. The alley had become a corridor. Walls on both sides, hunters in front and behind. Nowhere to run. "Easy now," one of them said in a calm, almost gentle voice. "Don't make this harder." Helen opened her mouth to scream. The scream stuck in her throat. A strong hand clamped over her mouth. Another grabbed her shoulder, twisting her arm. She tried to break free, strike, push away, but her movements were helpless against the professional grip. A hood of thick fabric was pulled over her head, robbing her of sight. The world plunged into darkness and the smell of chemically treated material. Panic surged in a wave, but her body no longer belonged to her. Her hands were wrenched behind her back, bound with a plastic zip tie. Helen was lifted from the ground and carried. She heard the creak of an opening door, felt herself thrown onto a hard metal floor, the slam of a closing door, the roar of a starting engine. The van pulled away. Helen lay in complete darkness, bouncing over uneven roads. Each pothole resonated as pain in her bound hands and bruised knees. She tried to breathe evenly through the fabric hood, but there wasn't enough air. She suppressed panic by force of will, clinging to the remnants of self-control. The intellectual battle was over. The physical one had begun. And in it, she didn't have a single chance. The van drove for a long time. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time lost meaning. Finally, the vehicle stopped. The door flew open. Cold air rushed inside. Helen was roughly lifted, set on her feet. The hood was ripped from her head. Light blinded her for a moment. Helen squinted, then slowly opened her eyes and froze. She'd expected to see a basement, a warehouse, an abandoned building somewhere on the outskirts, a place where people disappeared. But reality proved far more terrifying. Around her stretched a gigantic construction site, flooded with bright floodlights. An enormous excavation descending into the earth. Scaffolding of rebar like the bones of a colossal skeleton. Tower cranes frozen like silent sentinels. And above it all, piercing the night sky, rose the unfinished Apex Tower. her father's final project, the cause of his death, his attempt at redemption. They'd brought her here, not by chance. This was a message, an execution site chosen with symbolic cruelty. "Move," one of the guards ordered, pushing her forward. Helen walked, stumbling on the uneven ground. Her hands were bound behind her back, her balance disrupted. They led her toward a modular office installed at the edge of the excavation. Light burned in the windows. Someone was inside. The door opened. She was shoved in. The office was Spartan but expensive. A desk of polished steel and glass, several leather chairs, a construction site map on the wall, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Behind the desk sat Victor Morrison. He was exactly as she remembered him from the funeral, only now without the mourning suit. Dark gray jacket, white shirt without a tie, short ash blonde hair, a square face with hard lines. Light blue, almost colorless eyes that looked at her without malice, without anger, with slight, almost scientific curiosity. He held a small cup of espresso and took a slow, measured sip. "Please, sit, Helen Carlyle," he said, nodding toward the chair opposite. His voice was as even as on the phone. "Let's discuss your actions." One of the guards cut the zip tie on her hands. Helen rubbed her numb wrists, slowly lowered herself into the chair. Her legs trembled. Her heart pounded. But she forced herself to keep her back straight, to look him in the eyes. Morrison set the cup on the desk and leaned back in his chair. His movements were economical, almost lazy. The calm of a predator who knows the prey isn't going anywhere. "Your father's journal," he began. "A touching thing. Redemption, repentance, the desire to correct mistakes. All of that is wonderful for novel." He raised a finger, lightly tapped it on the desk. "But do you really think that because of this lyricism, anyone will stop a $10 billion project?" His lips curved in a cold half-smile. "The publication will change nothing. Our lawyers will call the journal a forgery. Experts will point to inconsistencies in the handwriting in the final entries, stress, illness, whatever. And you'll be portrayed as an unbalanced daughter trying to smear a genius's memory for what? Attention? Money? Doesn't matter. The story will be invented." Helen sat motionless, and with each of his words, something inside her grew colder and tighter. Her main move, her only weapon, her bomb, had proven to be a dud. A minor inconvenience that the system would digest and spit out. "You've lost," Morrison said, in a simple, matter-of-fact tone. "The second you decided to play." He stood, circled the desk, and dropped a thick folder before Helen. Documents spilled onto the glass surface. Financial reports, bank statements, transaction diagrams. Numbers, columns, abbreviations she didn't understand, but she felt their weight. "You think this is about social housing?" Morrison leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk. His face was inches from hers. "That's trivial. A nice gesture we would have buried in 2 paragraphs of a contract." He straightened. "Your father, in the final weeks of his life, started digging. Not into architectural plans, into finances. He wanted to understand where the money for Apex came from, where $10 billion came from for a project during a crisis. And he found out." Morrison tapped his finger on the documents. "Monolith Corporation launders money for criminal organizations through construction projects. Apex isn't a tower. It's a laundromat. A massive, gleaming laundromat for very dirty, very dangerous money. Money from people who don't forgive." He sat again, crossing his arms over his chest. He rested his gaze on her, studying her reaction as if she were another line item in his risk assessment. "The journal you leaked to the journalists is smoke," he said. "A sentimental confession from a genius. Touching, but harmless. His working notes, the financial records he compiled, those are a death sentence. Not for us, for the people behind us. And those documents, we believe, are with you as well." Helen looked at him, and the world around her came apart. She had thought she understood the truth. She had thought the journal was the key. But the journal was only the tip of the iceberg, the visible edge of a monstrous secret she could barely comprehend. "Now you understand?" Morrison tilted his head slightly. "You drew attention to yourself. You became the thread leading to those documents. You stopped being just a daughter. You became the primary threat." Silence settled in the office, heavy and absolute. Helen Carlyle sat in the chair, bound not by rope, but by the horror of understanding. She had been playing a game whose rules she didn't know. She thought she was fighting for her father's memory. In reality, she was trapped at the epicenter of a war where the stakes were not reputation, not even billions. The stake was her life. Plastic zip ties cut into her wrists, leaving red grooves on her pale skin. She sat on a metal chair in the middle of Morrison's office, her arms twisted behind her back. The glass wall opened onto the chasm of the apex excavation, an enormous wound in the body of the city, drowned in floodlights. Rebar jutted from concrete like exposed ribs. Morrison paced in front of her with slow, measured steps, heel to toe, soundless. His icy blue eyes watched her without anger, almost with academic interest. His voice stayed level, without inflection, as if he were explaining to a junior colleague the details of a dull but necessary plan. "Everything is thought through, Miss Carlyle." He stopped by the window, his silhouette outlined against the night sky. "In a few minutes, there'll be a minor fire on site. An accident. Shorted electrical wiring in one of the older site trailers. Happens on jobs like this." He turned back to her. "They'll find your body in the burned-out unit. Very tragic. The daughter of a great architect, trying to preserve her father's legacy, becomes a victim of an accident at his final project. The symbolism is almost poetic." Helen said nothing. Cold gripped her from within more tightly than the plastic bit into her skin. Her brain raced, feverish, searching for options, paths to escape. Nothing. She was in the heart of his territory, surrounded by his people, bound and helpless. Morrison walked to the desk and picked up her phone. The screen lit his face from below, giving his features a ghostly cast. "The most ironic part," he went on, slowly turning the phone in his fingers, "is that we'll pin the blame on the very activists you were so eager to protect. Thanks to your little leak, the city's on the brink of revolt. Protests at the site, demonstrations, demands to shut the project down." He set the phone on the desk with a soft click. "Everyone will decide desperate radicals set the fire, and you just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The chaos you unleashed becomes the perfect cover for your death. No one will dig deeper. The case will be closed in a week." His logic was flawless, reinforced concrete. Helen watched each piece of the plan slot into place, forming a solid structure that left no gaps for doubt. He wasn't just killing her. He was designing the murder with the same precision her father had used for buildings. Morrison sat and pulled her laptop closer, the same one his men had confiscated when they took her. He opened it. The screen flared to life. "Now let's find what all this was really about." His fingers brushed the trackpad. "Your father's financial records, the documents he compiled. You have them somewhere, don't you?" He began working through the folders, methodical and confident. To him, she was only a passive object now, a frightened woman whose tools, phone and laptop, lay under his hands. By taking her devices, he believed he'd taken all her power, leaving a helpless shell waiting for its fate. Helen watched him. There was no fear left in her gray eyes. Panic had burned out, leaving only a cold, crystalline clarity. She no longer saw a predator. She saw a man making a fatal mistake. "You've taken everything," she said quietly, distinctly. Morrison didn't look up from the screen. "But did you check the email drafts?" The question landed so calmly, so academically, that he froze. His finger halted over the trackpad. He raised his head. In his perfectly constructed plan, that detail, email drafts, registered like a glitch in the system. Minor, almost absurd, but the tone in which she'd asked was wrong. This wasn't the plea of someone desperate. It was the voice of someone holding a card he hadn't seen yet. A frown creased his forehead. A flicker of irritation crossed his colorless eyes. "Drafts?" he repeated, as if testing how ridiculous the word sounded. He opened her mail client. A few clicks. Drafts. There was a single message. Recipient: Federal Bureau of Economic Crimes, FSB of Russia. Subject: Financial fraud by Monolith Corporation. Laundering of criminal assets. One file was attached. Name: Moscow_NEN_1739_high_res.jpg. Size: 127 megabytes. Morrison stared at the screen, then looked at Helen. Confusion slid into contempt. It looked like a pathetic, last-ditch bluff. He opened the file. An ultra-detailed digital scan of an old map of Moscow filled the screen. Yellowed paper, fine ink lines mapping the streets, buildings, churches of a city long gone. Inscriptions in Church Slavonic and Latin. Flourished cartouches in the corners. A wind rose. Every crack in the paper, every stain of time was visible in razor clarity. He looked at it for a second. 2. Then leaned back and let out a short, dry laugh that sounded almost like a bark. "This is your threat?" His lips stretched in a cold smile. An old map? He shook his head, as if unable to believe the stupidity he was witnessing. "You thought you'd bury us under sentimental trash from your archives? Send the feds a picture?" His voice dripped with mockery. "That's brilliant, Ms. Carlyle. Almost as effective as publishing your father's journal." His confidence flooded back, stronger than before. To him, this was the final proof of her helplessness, the last pitiful swipe of a cornered animal. "It's called steganography," Helen Carlyle said. Her voice was level, almost didactic. The tone of an instructor explaining a basic concept to a student. "My specialty isn't just paper. It's data. Digital restoration, archiving, information security. The entire folder of your precious financial documents, every report, every bank statement, every offshore transfer scheme you mentioned, is encrypted and embedded inside that image." The smile drained from his face. "The data are hidden in the color code of each pixel, like a digital watermark. The changes are invisible to the eye, but a decoder program will pull them out. You're not looking at a map, Morrison. You're looking at the complete archive of Monolith's crimes. 127 megabytes of evidence." His jaw clenched. The fingers resting on the desk tightened. "And even if you destroy this laptop right now," she went on, her voice growing steadier with every word, "it won't matter. The draft is tied to an automated send through a cloud service. The timer started the moment you opened the mail client. The system script registered the access." She paused, holding his gaze. "If this message isn't manually deleted within an hour, 57 minutes from now, it'll send on its own, and the key to decrypt it, the decoding algorithm, is already in a safe deposit box with an independent notary. It gets released if I die or disappear, automatically, on a timer. The office plunged into a deeper silence. Outside, the distant hum of generators bled through the walls. Inside, only the faint whir of the laptop fan. Morrison's face shifted. Helen watched emotion move across his usually blank mask like tectonic plates. Certainty, confusion, realization, rage. He looked at the screen, then at her, back to the screen. His mind, trained for direct, force-based solutions, for straight lines from problem to elimination, tripped over the shape she'd drawn. The cleaner, the shadow operator, was suddenly outmaneuvered. The quiet archive mouse had led him by the nose. She hadn't brought a knife to a gunfight. She'd brought a plague. And he had been the one to smash the vial by opening that draft. "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but his voice no longer sounded sure. "Check," Helen answered simply. "You have 55 minutes." He shot to his feet. His world, built on control and predictability, was cracking. The system was failing. A variable he'd written off as insignificant had revealed itself to be critical. His mind raced through options. Delete the draft? But the key was already with the notary. Kill her now? The email would go out in an hour, and without her, they couldn't stop the decryption. Find the notary? In under an hour? Impossible. She hadn't said which one. The trap was perfect. A dead man's switch, an engine that fires after its maker is gone. He'd read about systems like that in nuclear strategy briefings. She'd applied the same logic to an information war. And worst of all, he couldn't know for sure if she was lying. The risk was absolute. Rage swept through him, burning away the last of his composure. The famed calm shattered. If intellect had lost, only brute force remained, primitive but familiar. Morrison lunged. 2 strides and he ripped her off the chair. Metal crashed to the concrete floor. His hands clamped around her throat. His face twisted with fury. For the first time in years, he'd lost the mask. "Turn off the timer," he hissed, tightening his grip. "Now!" Helen couldn't breathe. The edges of the world darkened. His fingers crushed her carotid, choking off oxygen. But she didn't claw at his hands, didn't kick or thrash. She just looked him in the eye with perfect calm. Because she heard what he didn't. The sharp crack of breaking glass. The office wall exploded inward in a storm of shards. 3 figures in black tactical gear poured through the opening, rifles raised, red laser dots sweeping the room. "FSB! On the ground! Hands on your head!" Morrison froze. His fingers loosened. Helen collapsed to her knees, sucking air into her burned throat. 3 more operators slammed through the door. The office filled with shouted commands, the stomp of boots, the metallic clack of bolts. Red dots converged on Morrison's chest. "Hands! On your head! Now!" He raised them slowly. His face slid back into its old mask, but his eyes betrayed the shock. They drove him to the floor, wrenched his arms behind his back, cuffed him. Efficient, fast. The same way his men had taken Helen hours ago. One operator knelt by her and sliced through the zip ties. Another was already seated at the laptop, fingers flying. "Draft intercepted," he reported into his headset. Timer stopped. File secure. The team leader, a broad man with a scar along his cheek, crouched in front of Helen. "Ms. Carlyle?" She nodded, still fighting for breath. "Major Sokolov, Cybercrime Division. You're safe now." He helped her up. As soon as the draft to our address hit our system, we started tracking. The program flagged it when someone opened it from another device, your laptop. The trace led us here. Helen looked toward Morrison. 2 men pinned him to the floor. He stared back with an expression she couldn't read. Shock? Fury? Respect? They didn't wait for the email to send? She rasped. Why wait? Sokolov gave a brief, wry smile. An attempt to access a suspicious draft addressed to us is reason enough to move. You planned this well. The final showdown ended not with force, but with the click of a mechanism working exactly as designed. The trap Helen had set wasn't supposed to trigger an hour later. It fired the moment Victor Morrison opened the file. His own curiosity had been the trigger. 4 days later. Rain rattled against the windows of the State Historical Archive. Helen Carlyle stood at her workstation, looking through the fogged glass at a gray New York. The city thrummed with the news, the biggest corruption scandal of the decade. Top executives of Monolith Corporation arrested. Construction of Apex Tower frozen pending investigation. On her desk lay a fresh printout, the old map that had saved her life. The paper was new, the ink still crisp, but the image was from 1739, a city that no longer existed. Streets erased by time and projects like her father's. Buildings demolished in the name of progress. The door opened. Her supervisor came in, a white-bearded man with kind eyes behind thick lenses. Helen, he called softly, joining her at the window. You've seen the news? Yes. He stood with her in silence, gazing out. Through the curtain of rain, the outline of Sentinel Tower was just visible, the first of her father's landmarks, the symbol of his triumph. Your father rebuilt this whole city, he said quietly, wiped out half its historic center, raised a new world on top of the old. Helen picked up the map. Her finger traced a thin line where a buried river once ran beneath downtown, long ago forced into pipes and darkness. Across streets now gone, over buildings reduced to dust. Sometimes, to see a city's real face, she said, you just have to look at the right map. Her supervisor nodded, gave her a knowing smile, and left her with the rain and the ghosts. Helen set the sheet back on the desk. Her fingers, trained to handle fragile paper, moved to the keyboard. The workday went on. Collections waited to be cataloged. History needed tending. Outside, the new city roared. Glass, noise, indifference. But here, in the quiet of the archive basement, among yellowed folios and old maps, Helen kept the truth. Cities can be rebuilt. Buildings can fall. Streets can be renamed. But the past cannot be erased as long as someone remembers, and as long as there are maps that still show the way home.